I'm Matt.
I'm Shane.
And if you like what you hear, make sure you hit that thumbs up button real hard and make sure you subscribe to Comic Movie Marks.
And also click that little bell for all of the notifications.
Whee!
Always remember,
if Trailer Trash can do it,
anyone can do it.
Well, it didn't take the summer solstice to make people go batty in Los Angeles. The premiere of the movie Batman did that job. It took 10 years for the movie to reach the silver screen, and it looks like it struck gold.
This time it is to the big screen. Warner Brothers is spending millions to bring millionaire Bruce Wayne and his alter ego to life. Is this a gamble for the studio? Will Batman pay off? Will there be bat hysteria?
Teresa Lucanis joins us live from the Americana Theaters in Southfield with a sneak peek at what many predict will be the film sensation of the summer. Teresa?
Dana, I think the marquee says it all for Bat fans. Finally, Batman the movie is here. This is the film they have been waiting for.
The crowd started gathering over the weekend in anticipation of a movie premiere so big it had to be held in 2 theaters. There's no other way of putting it. This evening, Los Angeles has gone bats.
A judge ruled a Chicago man went too far masquerading as the Cape Crusader. The judge said Ron Ruding may not parachute in public wearing his Batman suit.
Keaton's casting as the Dark Knight was the most controversial aspect of the film's production, but those concerns seem to be over.
Unlike the TV series, which took a campy look at the dynamic duo, the movie promises to stick closer to the comic book version, which takes the Cape Crusader very seriously.
And I'll tell you, already people are lining up to buy tickets to the special 12:20 showing of Batman this morning at the Americana. There are 8 showings daily, as you can see here at the Americana, so I guess Bat fans don't have to settle for the same Bat time or even the same Bat theater starting tomorrow. Reporting live from the Americana in Southfield, Teresa Lucanis, TV2 Eyewitness News.
I'm Batman, motherfucker. Hello and welcome everyone to another Comic Movie Marks video.
Woo! We just crossed the Batman 1989 30th anniversary.
Just crossed?
Yeah, we're a little bit late. It happened last month. The Batman 1989 came out. For you young whippersnappers, we are going to be revisiting some of Batman 1989 and also giving some nostalgia, hopefully some interesting facts, some different pieces that maybe you didn't know from that film.
Batman 89, where were you when Batamania ran wild on Hollywood?
So Batman 89, if you didn't know, as Matt mentioned, Batmania, that's what everyone had dubbed the film at the time. It was craziness. It was something that a lot of people did not know and were not expecting. This was one of the highest budgeted films at the time of a whopping $35 million. Yes, that's right.
Dun, dun, dun.
$35 million. What was Warner Brothers going to do? Obviously, a little bit of a different time, but yes, this had the highest budget at the time.
All the bat puns aside, as the 80s liked to overuse over and over again, was all the bat puns. The craziness that was Batamania was running wild throughout all different types of media. CNN, regular Hollywood media. It was all over the place. Something that was truly unique for the time because a superhero was actually being taken serious.
Yeah, people were clamoring for a different version of a superhero. If you remember, back in the time, Batman was really only known in the mainstream for the Adam West and Burt Ward TV show. You know, the Pow, the Whams, all that good stuff. It wasn't taken all that serious. We also had the Richard Donner Superman, the 4 movies. Yes, shockingly, there were 4 movies that had just concluded a couple years prior to Batman 89 coming out. So superheroes were very different at the time, and people were clamoring for something a little bit darker, maybe a little bit more serious, and a little bit closer to the comic book version. Sam Hamm began writing the scripts right around the time of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, which, if you've read that, is a very dark version of Batman, and even darker than what was originally written and intended. A few years prior to Hamm beginning to write the scripts for Batman 89, a gentleman by the name of Michael Uslan, who earned a law degree, but he decided to start teaching a course in comic books at the Indiana University. Yes, at the time, you could get a credit from university in comic books.
Some MCU fans really need that credit.
Eventually, Michael Uslan decided to become a producer and try to earn the rights to Batman. He spent 10 years trying to get a Batman movie, and his main goal was to bring Batman to the big screen close to the version that was in the comic books, not like the series that we were used to. Uslan eventually pitched his darker version of a Batman movie to a gentleman by the name of Peter Gruber, who appreciated that take. And then Gruber, alongside John Peters, you'll recognize that name, negotiated a deal with WB to produce the Batman film.
Did almost $1 billion in those days because we had a line where when he comes up, he says, "I'm Batman." The line from the movie was, "I'm Batman, motherfucker." And Warner's made me take out the motherfucker. And I wanted to do that because I knew the kids in the audience would go, "Yeah, all right."
Within that 10-year span of writing the script for Batman, Sam Hamm also came across a script by Tom Mankiewicz. Now, if you don't know who Tom Mankiewicz is, he was heavily involved in the original Superman and Superman 2, the Donner Cut. He was the creative consultant for Richard Donner. Now, he didn't do anything for Richard Lester, who ended up getting sole credit as a director for Superman 2 because of, as we have stated in our past video, there's a lot of hubbub about that. And the Salkinds actually screwed Richard Donner out of anything to do with Superman 2. It took 26 years for his actual version to come out. But Tom Mankiewicz was the creative consultant and apparently had a script in the office of Bonnie Lee. And Bonnie Lee helped facilitate the first meeting with our director for Batman 89, Tim Burton.
Tim Burton, for those who don't know, actually used to do other Disney movies prior to the shitty Dumbo movie that came out. I'm just kidding, I have not seen Dumbo. But he at one point did a mini film titled Frankenweenie for Disney, which they, at the time, decided, maybe Tim Burton isn't someone that we really want to work with, and they separated. Paul Rubens, better known as Pee Wee Herman or Public Jerk-Off Artist, found and saw Tim Burton, he was very intrigued by Frankenweenie and decided to bring him over to Warner Brothers to distribute Pee-wee's Big Adventure, which would be known as Tim Burton's first full-length feature film. If you watch that movie, it's a little creepy, makes perfect sense. Tim Burton eventually went on to produce Beetlejuice in 1988 before landing the director's role in Batman 1989.
Beetlejuice, of course, having one of my favorite moments in PG movie history.
You bunch of losers! You're working with a professional here! Nice fucking model!
WB was very intrigued with what Tim Burton was able to accomplish with Beetlejuice, as it was a very low-budget film, but incredibly successful in the box office for the time.
He received his first large-budget film with Batman, and something that's really interesting is when you hear this interview with Jack Nicholson, he talks about how well Tim Burton handled the pressure of handling a very large-budget film and dealing with the studio during Batman 1989.
Once we got in production, the astounding thing to me about Tim was and is the unshakable central self-confidence and lack of fear that he has. When I watched him, this was part of the scuttlebutt. His Batman was the biggest production in history in England in terms of production costs and so forth and so on. And watching him, and you see this, I'm pretty low-key, you'd see it on me. You don't see pressure on this kid. I'm thinking, geez, this guy's in his early 20s. He's got the biggest budget in history. It's not even a factor. You know, he just goes about his business and does it.
Prior to Michael Keaton being cast as Batman, they first cast Jack Nicholson as the Joker. Something that was very interesting with the whole deal that came about with Jack Nicholson was at one point, Goober and Burton signed Tim Curry to a pay-or-play deal, which put a little bit more pressure on Jack Nicholson to eventually sign on. Tim Curry was eventually paid to not play the Joker. Could you imagine that? Being paid not to play someone? Michael Uslan claims to have wanted Jack Nicholson as a Joker ever since he saw Nicholson in The Shining. You can see the craziness in Jack Nicholson. Eventually, Nicholson accepted the role of the Joker, in which he was paid $6 million, which was a little bit below his average salary of $10 million at the time per film. But part of the deal that was included is Jack Nicholson would earn a percentage of the film's total earnings, including merchandise sales, which, as we mentioned before, Batmania was going crazy and merchandise sales were through the roof. They had lunch boxes, they had action figures, they had all sorts of things. So I'm sure Nicholson got a pretty penny from that.
Something that was notable in the late 80s promos that basically all these news outlets were producing was that Jack Nicholson brought the star power. He brought the seriousness to this movie. This is what legitimized it completely. His take on the Joker, also, when you look at the reviews, is also what blew everybody away. This is the guy that sold this movie for a lot of fans and a lot of critics. He was the true motivation behind the success of this movie, in my humble opinion. Nicholson also only really accepted the role when he knew it was going to be a serious take. He wasn't going to do things for the kids. This was something that was going to be more than just for the kids. This was supposed to be his interpretation of what he felt the Joker should be. Again, once the studio took this stuff serious, that's when Jack Nicholson really came aboard and also got a huge payday for it.
Before we had Batfleck, we had the controversial casting of Michael Keaton as Batman. Many of you youngins might know Michael Keaton as the Vulture from Spider-Man Homecoming, but he was obviously way better in Batman 1989. At the time, the casting was one of the biggest risks for Tim Burton. Obviously, he was very familiar with Michael Keaton's work as they worked together on Beetlejuice. But there was even a point where a petition was created and sent to WB with the title Michael Keaton as the Batman, ? Ooh, they were serious. Pretty much to remove Michael Keaton from the film as Batman.
At least WB is somewhat consistent on ignoring petitions.
WB, of course, was more interested in traditional actors at the time to play Batman. Some names that were thrown out there were Harrison Ford, Tom Selleck, Kevin Costner, Dennis Quaid, and Mel Gibson.
And of course, this guy.
I would be Batman if they let me. I'd be Batman if I had a cape. I'd be Batman. Yes, yes.
One other odd possible casting at one point, because WB is extremely inconsistent and not sure exactly the direction they want to go. Originally, Bill Murray was thought of being Batman because they were going to keep it in the campy style, the Adam West style. And Bill Murray was apparently one of the first guys you thought of when you wanted to stick him into a Batman costume. It probably wouldn't even been a rubber mold like it is in the 89 version. It probably would have been back to the spandex. The rubber mold was something that Bob Kane and Tim Burton insisted on. And there's some early concept art that looks phenomenal. It actually, of course, concept art always looks better than the end result a lot of the time because, hey, it's drawings, you can do a lot. But how they formed the costume was quite interesting as well, because we look at now with The Dark Knight how it was done in pieces so he could turn his head so it could make it easier backing out of the driveway. But when it was eventually done, it was kind of put together in pieces, a torso, and it's even talked about how the joints were separated so he could bend and flex and everything else. But even then, it was still impossible to move around. And of course, it has now created the ultimate look, the Batman turn. And of course, because Michael Keaton's neck was unable to turn because it was attached to the cowl, he has to turn his whole body. And why I was actually turning my body like that when I said it, I have no idea. But it created a great scene of the Batman turn, and it happened all the way up until Christian Bale's Batman in The Dark Knight. And you can see it in all the different GIFs. It's out there. So it was an interesting concept, the latex, and how they came up with different variations of the cape as well. Again, more heavy latex. And it was something that was truly unique at the time of how they constructed the suit, because of course the Christopher Reeves was just spandex. This was kind of a muscle suit for the most part, attached to a person, molded to a person's body, to Keaton's specifically, and it was constructed in a way to make him look more imposing.
They also had a very special producer of the boots for Batman.
Yeah, apparently John Peters, as you'll hear throughout this, was a very interesting producer. He never really got along very well with Tim Burton, but yet him and Tim Burton continued to do projects together. But he's definitely the guy to try to make the most profit. He's a producer, so he's trying to make the most profit for the studio as possible. And if you watched anything with him, if you watched that Superman Lives documentary, you see that everything had a reason. If you watch that Kevin Smith talk that he does, and he talks about John Peters, there needed to be a toy. They wanted a little robot, they wanted the little doll, they wanted a Chewie, and Kevin Smith was going to give him his Chewie. That was his motivation for a lot of things, was producing the most amount of toys and sponsors for these movies. And a fun little fact to throw in, Nike actually was part of this, and Nike made the Batman boots.
John Peters came to me one day and said, Warners have this thing going with Nike. Can you use any of their sportswear? And I talked to Bob and he said, well, 80s sportswear is not going to fit in with our 1940s look. And then it just came to us that, why don't they make the Bat boots? They made the Bat boots from scratch based on one of their cross trainers at the time. Michael and the stunt guys absolutely loved them. They had, a really supportive, comfortable boot.
So they were kind of symbolized with the Batman boots. And apparently, of course, Keaton and the stunt guys say they were some of the best boots they ever wore.
Air Nike Batman boots.
Could you imagine if he had to pump those up like just before he about to...
It wouldn't surprise me if Schumacher continued with the series, if eventually maybe that's what we got. Obviously, several people were still unconvinced with the Michael Keaton casting, so something that Burton did to help convince several people like Michael Uslan that Keaton was the right person for this role, Burton showed them an unreleased drama starring Michael Keaton called Clean and Sober. One of the things that Burton had said was, I don't know how to put a serious actor in a Batman costume without getting inadvertent laughs from the audience. But I do know with Michael Keaton, we could create a portrayal of this driven and consumed Bruce Wayne, and audiences would go, yeah, he could do that. Which is one of the reasons they included the awesome scene, you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts.
Numbered here. Are you nuts? You want to get nuts? Come on, let's get nuts. Because I just wrote it.
So something that the studio execs did to help kind of bring down the worry of a lot of fans that they thought maybe this film was still going to be campy with the casting of Michael Keaton is they cut a trailer and released it to show, no, this is a serious version of Batman. Fans went on to pay $25 for copies of the trailer. Could you imagine? Now we just watch anything on YouTube on repeat. I still watch Man of Steel trailers to this day. And at the time, people were essentially paying the price for a full movie just for the trailer because it was that groundbreaking. Bus stops had posters stolen out of the displays because people were clamoring for this movie. Then at the time, obviously the movie was released and it became the highest grossing film, breaking $251 million domestically and $411 million worldwide.
That's a whole lot of 80s money right there.
I bet that would go a lot further than it does now.
Well, of course it does, because issues. Never mind. This is a Batman 89 one, not an inflation seminar.
Right. Yes, exactly. Moving on. Eventually, Tim Burton went on to do Batman Returns, brought Michael Keaton back to play the role of Batman, also brought on Danny DeVito, Michelle Pfeiffer, Christopher Walken, big names at the time in the 80s to play very specific roles. Batman Returns, a lot of people would consider to be an even darker version of Batman. There's some very dark moments in that movie, and ultimately it ended up doing only $266 million worldwide, which ultimately led the studio to want to broaden its audience, maybe do a little bit more family-friendly type Batman.
Something that also came about later on in these future Batman movies was Robin. Robin was actually destined to be in the original Batman 1989, but Robin was removed early on after the first draft. But they had a very interesting scenario, as it was described, was as Batman is chasing the Joker with automobiles, Joker drives through a circus tent, ends up killing some of the Graysons, and Dick Grayson becomes the sidekick of Batman, and that's how originally the first draft of Batman 89 was. There was going to be a Robin, and Returns was actually going to have Marlon Wayans playing Robin. Very unique for the time. No one would have expected that, and probably no one would have cared, but nowadays with the outrage culture, who knows what would have happened. We also were going to have a black Two-Face as well, played by Billy D. Williams. Again, probably wouldn't even cared.
Definitely a different time for Batman movies, for comic book movies, just in general. Eventually, Tim Burton and the studio no longer wanted to continue with the trilogy, the Burton Batman trilogy, and eventually Warner Brothers brought in Joel Schumacher, which gave us Batman Forever and the beloved Batman and Robin. Woo! A lot of that was due to Warner Brothers essentially wanting to capitalize on the merchandise sales, the toys, the broader audience, the making films a little bit more family friendly. You know, we got people like Jim Carrey as the Riddler, which is the best Riddler in my opinion, live action. Obviously there's probably 2 or 3 now with Gotham, but so we got also Chris O'Donnell at the time as Robin. So obviously a lot more family friendly, a lot more colorful. You started getting puns. You got a Batman Visa. Even some of the sponsors like Burger King and McDonald's started getting on board. So this was starting to now be more aimed towards kids and more family friendly so that they could capitalize on the toys and the action figures. And it was turned up to an even higher volume with Batman and Robin, where you started getting the ice suits and different things like that, just so that they can sell more toys to kids.
Tonight's forecast. A freeze is coming. Allow me to break the ice. You are not sending me to the cooler. Freeze well. What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age! Stay cool, bird boy. Let's kick some ice.
It's definitely a different time, and the progression of comic book movies back then, seeing what the possibilities is with that gross market when it comes to obviously the preteens, the younger generation, selling toys is a big part of it. Having sponsors tied in with those toys like Happy Meals is a big part of it. And when you start taking away creativity over that mass consumption, as we heard with James Mangold talking about it, when it comes to restrictive nature of having to have a little toy for this or matching it up with that, it takes away that creativeness. And again, we watched it progress through the Batman movies more and more. As the creativity got taken away for toys and merchandise, the worse the movies got. So, for the love of God, let's not repeat history.
It might be too late for that. But it is fascinating that you get people like Michael Uslan who are so intrigued by the character of Batman, and they really want to stick to the Bob Kane and Bill Finger version that was released of just how he was, and they did not have that at the time. As we mentioned before, it was just the Adam West version on TV that most people were familiar with. So they wanted people like Michael Uslan, even Sam Hamm, and even Tom Mankiewicz. They wanted a version that was close to the comic books. And God forbid we try to do that with, I don't know, maybe Superman or another version of Batman, where we maybe try to stick closer to what is familiar with the comic books and what the characters are supposed to be, and maybe get to a different level with the characters. So it's interesting to kind of see how studios, this one in particular with Warner Brothers, how they go down this road of, oh shoot, no, this is too dark. And then they get to the point where they try to reel it back in, and no, we need to capitalize on toys, and we need to have a broader audience and try to crack the $1 billion mark. These are the decisions that they start to make, and ultimately we end up with Batman and Robin. You know, you get Arnold Schwarzenegger, you get some well-known faces, George Clooney, and make it a little bit more family friendly. Nobody wants that. Then the entire thing had to be rebooted, and we get the glorious Christopher Nolan trilogy. Those are the types of films that people are clamoring for, and those are more of what we need. Granted, Christopher Nolan's was not really all that close to the comic books, but he still held to the same essence of the character of Batman, and he wanted him to be taken serious.
In case I don't see you,
good afternoon, good evening, and good night.